By dawn in 1934, the newspaper bag lay folded clean on the frozen street behind the barricade the city had thrown up overnight across Enfield Avenue. Not scattered, not torn open with its papers spilled into the ice dark like they ought to be. Folded, neat, dry as a palm laid flat indoors. The frost around it was unbroken. No boot prints led toward it. No boot prints led away. Around that folded bag, the street held a thin skin of dirty frost, smooth as glass pressed by no foot at all. Thomas Cook was 16 and had run that route every dawn for 3 years straight. He was the kind of boy who did not oversleep. He did not miss houses. He did not leave papers in the rain without wrapping them first in brown paper he bought with his own dime. His mother knew his footstep on the porch before the back door even opened. His employer, Mr. Vane at the Duluth Times office, knew him by the exact hour he returned, 5:47 a.m., always within 3 minutes. Not because anyone timed him, but because a man does not forget a hand he can trust with the dawn route in a small city, where news still mattered, and papers had to reach the porch dry and on time. Thomas lived with his mother and his sister Ruth in a 2-room house on Sioux Street, 4 blocks from the avenue where the Paperboy route began. His father had died in the mines near Aurora when Thomas was 7. The boy had taken the route at 13 and had not missed a single day. His mother kept his supper hot until he came home. Ruth, who was 11, sometimes watched from the window to see him come back through the winter dark with his satchel light. On the morning of March 15, 1934, Thomas left the house at 4:30 a.m., as he did every morning. He kissed his mother's cheek. She was already awake, setting water to boil. She heard the back door close. She heard his boots on the frozen ground heading toward the avenue. The canvas satchel was already loaded at the Times office. He would pick it up at the corner. From there, the route ran north along Enfield Avenue for 2 blocks, then circled back through the residential streets, then returned to the office by first light. Nobody remembers hearing anything strange that morning at first. Not a cry, not a whistle, though later, so many would swear they had heard his 2-note whistle, the one he used to keep his rhythm while he walked in the dark. But Thomas Cook never came home. At 5:47 a.m., when he should have been back, his chair at the breakfast table was empty. His mother waited. At 6 a.m., she sent Ruth to run to the Times office to ask if something had kept him late. The boy who worked the morning desk at the office, a hand named Garrett, said Thomas had picked up his satchel right on time. 4:15, Garrett said. Same as always. I watched him go out the door. By 6:30 a.m., men were walking the route with lanterns still burning in the dawn gray. They found nothing. No torn satchel, no sign of struggle, no body lying in a drift. The street was empty. It was only when they reached the northern end of Enfield Avenue that they stopped and went quiet. The city of Duluth, Minnesota, had sealed off the last 3 blocks of Enfield Avenue 3 weeks prior. They had ordered the street condemned. Structural settling had cracked the foundations of the warehouses that lined it. The city had nailed planks across the windows. They had strung wire and posted signs in red paint. Condemned. Do not enter. They had even thrown up a heavy wooden barricade, 6 feet of pine boards nailed to posts, across the street itself. The barricade had been installed overnight on March 14th, the day before Thomas Cook vanished. On the morning of March 15th, that barricade had not been moved. It stood exactly as the city had left it. But behind the barricade, on the wrong side of the sealed street, the delivery bag lay clean and folded. For a moment, nobody spoke. The men with lanterns stood in the frost and looked at the barricade, then at each other. One of them, a foreman named Hull, approached the barricade and felt along its edge. The nails were driven tight. The wood was cold and solid. He called over his shoulder, "Someone's going to have to move this." It took 4 men to lift the boards enough to slip past. When they did, Hull reached down and picked up the satchel. It was warm, not hot, warm, as if it had just been put down. He opened the flap. The newspapers inside were clean. Not a single drop of frost stuck to the folding. The pages were dry. Not even a skin of moisture where morning dew ought to stick to old newsprint. Inside the bag, everything was warm and dry as an indoor room. Hull looked at the ground around the bag. Frost lay everywhere else on that sealed-off street. But where the satchel had rested, the frost had not formed. The ground beneath it was bare and dark, like the frost had been melted away or had never been there at all. "Where is the boy?" Hull asked. But nobody answered him. They searched the sealed street from end to end. They dragged the shallow water pooled at the far end. They called his name toward the boarded windows. Nothing. No sound came back. No footprint marked the frost anywhere on that street. Not leading in, not leading out. Just the bag, sitting warm and dry behind the barricade in a place the city had locked 3 days before Thomas Cook's route was supposed to take him anywhere near it. By first light, when the news began to spread through the neighborhoods and the mills, mothers in Duluth, Minnesota, began telling their children not to walk down Enfield Avenue, even in daylight. Not now. Not ever. The street was already condemned by the city. Now it was condemned by something else, something they could not name and would not speak about out loud while the sun was still rising. Fathers warned sons not to cut through that section on their way to work. The older hands in the mills and on the docks, men who had lived their whole lives in that city, suddenly shifted their routes and their habits. They did not say why. They did not need to. Everybody had heard about the boy. Everybody knew about the bag. By noon on March 15th, the police had been called. By evening, the mothers were keeping closer watch on their own children's whereabouts, and in the coming days, as the search widened and the impossible facts became undeniable, the question that moved through Duluth, Minnesota was not, "Where is Thomas Cook?" but something quieter and more terrible. What took him into a place that was supposed to be sealed, and how did it fold his bag so neat before it brought it back out? The timeline of those 72 hours was sharp and strange, and men in Duluth, Minnesota, still speak about it in a particular tone. The tone people use when they are trying to remember something that does not make sense no matter how many times they turn it over in their minds. Thomas Cook had left his house at 4:30 a.m. on March 15th. His mother was sure of the time because she heard the back door close, and she had just set the kettle on the stove. She knew the sound of his boots on the frozen ground. She knew the exact cadence of his walk. At 4:45 a.m., neighbors 2 blocks over reported hearing his 2-note cattle whistle, the call he used to keep rhythm in the dark, a high note followed by a lower one, clean and clear. "I heard him plain," one of them said. Meant he was in good spirits. Thomas always whistled when he was ready for the day. But at 5:15 a.m., a milk wagon driver on Sioux Street heard the same whistle again, coming from the opposite direction, from the east, where the route did not go. The driver thought nothing of it at first. Whistles carry strange in the cold before sunrise. But later, when he learned that Thomas Cook had not come home, he mentioned it to the police. "It was his whistle," he said. "I would know it anywhere, but it was coming from where he shouldn't have been." At 5:30 a.m., a woman named Mrs. Hendricks, who lived on the corner of Enfield and 3rd, swore she saw a boy, a figure at least, walking past her window with a canvas satchel. She was lighting her stove. She saw him pass by the frosted glass. She saw the shape of the satchel. She thought it was Thomas finishing his route early, but when she looked again, he was gone, and the snow on the sill outside her window showed no boot print at all. "I know what I saw," Mrs. Hendricks told the police. "I saw a boy walk past my window, but there was nothing in the snow, no mark of his feet." At 5:47 a.m., the exact hour Thomas Cook should have been returning to the Times office, a commotion erupted at the northern end of Enfield Avenue. The city workers who came to check the barricade in the early light found it intact but unusual. One of the nails on the western side was driven partway back out, as if someone had tried to pry it loose from inside the barricade and given up. Nobody remembered anyone loosening a nail. The barricade had been sealed and guarded. Nobody could approach it without the city foreman's permission. And behind it, in a place that was supposed to be empty and locked away, the delivery satchel sat folded and warm on the frozen street. The search began at first light. By 7 a.m., men were gathering at the mill office and the police station. By 8 a.m., the search party numbered 12 men, 3 dogs, and the foreman Hull, who had been the first to see the satchel. They brought lanterns even in daylight. a habit from searching mines and dark basements. They brought ropes. They brought grappling hooks. They tied strips of red cloth to the fence posts and the electric poles as they moved, marking the ground they had already covered so nobody would search the same street twice. This was organized. This was desperate. The dogs were brought from 3 different houses, a setter named Red, a hound called Bess, and a mongrel the hands called Scout. All 3 were good dogs, used to working in winter, used to finding lost things. Red and Bess belonged to men who worked the docks. Scout belonged to the mill. All 3 had been trained to track. They began at the northern end of Enfield Avenue, where the barricade stood. The dogs approached it cautiously. Then Red stopped. He would not go further. He sat down on his haunches and began to whine. A low, continuous sound, not quite a cry, more like a dog expressing a discomfort he could not put into words. Bess did the same. She lay down beside Red, her nose pressed to the frost, her breath making small clouds. Scout circled once, twice, then moved back toward the men, looking at them with an expression that seemed to ask a question. "They don't want to go past it," one of the hands said. "Dogs are smart," Hull replied. "They feel something we don't." But they pressed on. The men walked the frozen street in a line, shoulder to shoulder, their boots crunching on the rime, their breath visible in the cold air. They checked every doorway. They looked behind every abandoned crate. They called Thomas's name toward the boarded windows. Nothing answered. No sound came back, but the echo of their own voices. By midday, they had covered 2 miles. No sign of the boy. No torn clothing. No blood on the snow. No broken window where he might have been pulled inside. The red cloth strips they had tied to mark their progress hung neat and regular, like beads on a string marking where they had already looked. Everything was exactly as it should be, except that the boy was gone and his satchel had appeared in a place it should never have been. That night, around 9 p.m., as the search party gathered at the mill office to plan the next day, one of the men, a worker named Petty, mentioned something quietly. "One of the cloth strips came loose," he said. "The one we tied on the eastern post at the corner of 3rd. It was there at noon, but when we came back through at 4 p.m., it was gone." Hull looked at him. "It blew loose?" "Maybe," Petty said. "But it didn't blow away. We found it tied again, about 50 yards north on a post we hadn't reached yet. Tied the same knot, same cloth, but nobody tied it. We all walked through together and nobody stopped." The men said nothing. One of them stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the night was perfectly still. No wind. No movement in the trees. The older hands in Duluth, Minnesota began to exchange looks. They did not say anything out loud. They did not need to. Something in their faces had changed. The search was no longer a search for a lost boy. It was a vigil against something that did not follow the rules of normal loss. On the second day, March 16th, a new detail emerged. The night before, around midnight, a neighbor had heard something that made her wake and pull her shawl tight. It was a whistle. The 2-note whistle the one Thomas Cook always used. It came from the direction of Enfield Avenue, from beyond the barricade, from inside the sealed-off street. It came once. Then it did not come again. But it was his whistle. She was certain. She knew his whistle the way a mother knows her child's cry in a crowd. He was calling, she told the search party on the morning of March 16th. He was calling, and nobody could answer. On the afternoon of March 16th, Hull decided to move beyond the barricade itself. They had the city's permission now. Fear was beginning to move faster than bureaucracy. They pulled apart enough of the boarding to slip through into the sealed section of Enfield Avenue. The folded satchel was gone, taken into evidence by the police, but the ground where it had rested was still visible, a dark patch on the frost where nothing had frozen. The dogs refused. This time, all 3 of them refused. Red and Bess lay down immediately. Scout backed away and would not be coaxed forward. Even the men who loved these dogs and trusted them could not convince them to pass the barricade. They lay on the frozen ground and whined. All 3 of them, a chorus of distress that seemed to come from some place deeper than fear. "We go in without them," Hull said. Inside the sealed section, the air was different. It was colder, though there was no reason for it to be colder. It was quieter in a way that made men's breathing sound loud. The boarded windows stared down like closed eyes. The ground was undisturbed, no footprints, no disturbance of frost anywhere in sight. But on the eastern side of the street, where a fence post marked the boundary of a defunct warehouse lot, the men found something that made Hull stop. A second cloth strip, tied to the post. The same knot, the same red cloth. But this post was 50 yards beyond where the search had reached on the first day. This was deep inside the sealed section. This was in a place that should have been locked away for 3 weeks. "How did it get here?" one of the men asked. No one answered. That evening, as the search party stood in the mill office with coffee cups in their hands and the weight of the impossible pressing down on them, a sound came from outside. A soft knock. Metal on metal. It came from the direction of the sealed street. Just 2 knocks. Then silence. Then 2 more knocks, exactly the same rhythm, spaced exactly the same distance apart. The men looked at each other. One of them moved to the window and looked out into the darkness. Nothing, just the frozen street and the dark buildings and the fence posts marking the boundary of the search. But the knocking came again. Twice. Pause. Twice. Like a signal. Like a message. Like someone on the other side of a door, waiting to be let in. The foreman Hull sat down on a bench and rubbed his face with both hands. When he looked up, his expression had changed. The search had become something else. The question was no longer whether Thomas Cook was alive or dead. The question was whether there was any point in searching at all in a place where the normal rules had stopped applying. "We keep searching," Hull said quietly. "We have to." But on the morning of March 17th, when the search party gathered to continue, they found that one of the men, a young hand named Graves who had been part of the team, had not come to work. He had not come to his house. His landlady said he had not slept in his bed. A note was found on the doorstep of the mill office, written in handwriting that nobody recognized at first. It was brief. "Don't look for him. He's already home." The note was in Thomas Cook's handwriting. By the 3rd day, the search had become a ritual. It was no longer an effort to find a boy. It was an effort to hold back something that the search itself might be awakening. The men moved in organized lines through the sealed sections of Enfield Avenue, dragging hooks through the shallow water pooled in the basement of the old warehouse. Women brought food, bread, coffee, broth, and sat on porches with their shawls tight around their shoulders, waiting for men to return with news they all knew would not come. The priest, Father Conlon, walked alongside the search parties in his dark coat, his prayer book tucked under his arm, though he did not recite prayers out loud. Nobody asked him to. His presence was enough. It was a way of saying this was a sacred desperation now, not just a missing boy. The grid search had been expanded. They marked off sections of Enfield Avenue with surveyor's string. They assigned teams to each section. They kept ledgers, written records of what ground they had covered and at what hour. It was methodical. It was the way you search when you are afraid that if you do not remain organized, something worse will happen. As if the only thing holding back the impossible is discipline and the sight of your neighbors' faces moving through the frost beside you. On the morning of March 18th, 3 days after Thomas had vanished, a constable named Bryce brought the note to Hull. It was encased in a cloth envelope now, handled carefully as if it might burn if touched directly. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas Cook's. Every man in the search party knew his handwriting. He had written his name and address on every newspaper he delivered. Hundreds of boys in Duluth, Minnesota, had seen his neat, careful script on their porches for 3 years. "Don't look for him. He's already home." That was the entire message. "Where was it found?" Hull asked. "On the mill office doorstep," Bryce said. "Sometime between midnight and dawn. The night watchman didn't see it, but it was there when the morning shift arrived." Hull took the note and held it without opening the cloth. "Who recognizes this writing?" 15 men raised their hands. "It's his," one of them said. "I'd know his hand anywhere." "When was this written?" Hull asked. Nobody could answer that. The paper showed no signs of age. The ink was black and clear. It could have been written an hour before it was found. It could have been written days before. There was no way to tell. But Thomas Cook had been missing for 70 hours. He had been missing when this note was written. The theories began that afternoon, spoken quietly in the mill office and on the docks, the way men speak when they are trying to make sense of something that falls outside the boundary of what makes sense. Someone forged it, one of them said, someone who knew his hand well enough to copy it. Who? Another replied. Who would do that and why? Someone wanted us to stop looking, a third said. Or someone wanted us to know he wrote it after, said a fourth voice, after he was gone. The priest did not contribute to these theories. He listened, but when one of the men, an older hand named Corvin, said quietly, "It came from inside the sealed street, didn't it? From the same place the cloth strip came from." Father Conlon did not disagree. He simply closed his eyes for a moment and resumed his prayers. On the evening of March 18th, Hull made a decision. They would open one of the boarded warehouses. They would search inside systematically, floor by floor. It was the only place they had not looked. It was the only place that made sense now, if anywhere made sense. The city gave permission reluctantly. The warehouses had been condemned for structural reasons. The floor might not hold, but the search could not stop. The city foreman arrived with crowbars and opened the eastern warehouse, the one whose window Mrs. Hendricks had seen a boy pass by 3 mornings before. Inside, the air was still and cold. Dust lay thick on the floor. No footprints marked it. Nothing had moved inside that building in weeks. But on the second floor, in a storage room at the far end, they found something that made the men stop. Thomas Cook's coat. His school jacket. It was hanging on a nail, neat and careful, as if he had hung it there himself just moments before. It was not dusty. It was not cold. When Hull touched it, the fabric was warm. "How long?" he asked Bryce. "I don't know," Bryce said. "It's impossible." "Everything about this is impossible," Hull replied. He took the jacket down carefully. The lining was intact. Nothing was torn. Inside the pocket was Thomas's schoolbook, with his name written inside the front cover. The page was marked at a lesson dated March 15th, the day he vanished. The men brought the jacket to Father Conlon. He held it without speaking. His hands trembled slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "This is a visitation," he said. "God help us. This is a visitation from the boy himself." That night, the older hands in Duluth, Minnesota, began to keep their children closer. Mothers told their daughters not to walk to school alone, even in daylight. Fathers told their sons never to answer if they heard a whistle from the direction of Enfield Avenue. Not to answer, not to look, not to go toward it. The knowledge passed through the city like an infection, quiet and total. You did not speak about why. You simply obeyed. The logic was older than language. It was the logic of a place that had already decided something about the boundary between the world and the spaces just past it. On the night of March 19th, a woman named Eleanor Vance, a neighbor of Thomas's mother, decided to sit vigil outside her window. She had always been a light sleeper. She had always been the type to notice things. She sat in the dark with a lamp turned low, looking out at the street, watching for anything that might move. At 3 a.m., she saw him. A figure walked past her window, a boy in a delivery coat. His canvas satchel swung at his side. He was walking north toward Enfield Avenue, toward the sealed street. His face was pale in the starlight, but composed. He walked with purpose. He walked as if he knew exactly where he was going. Eleanor called out to him, but her voice caught. She could not make a sound. She tried to open the window, but her hands would not obey. She watched him walk to the corner and turn. She watched him disappear into the darkness beyond the intersection. In the morning, she reported what she had seen to the search party. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she spoke. "I know what I saw," she said. "I saw the boy. He was walking. He was going toward that place." By noon on March 19th, the search had become something else entirely. It was no longer a search for a living boy. It was a documentation of the impossible. The men took measurements. They made sketches. They interviewed anyone who had seen the note, the jacket, the cloth strips. They kept records. They tried to build a logical framework around something that refused to be logical. But the truth that moved through Duluth, Minnesota, unspoken but understood, was this. Something had taken Thomas Cook into a place where the normal rules did not apply. Something had borrowed his handwriting to tell them not to look. Something had kept his jacket warm and had sent him walking past windows in the deep night, walking toward a sealed street, walking toward whatever waited for him in the spaces where the city had tried to seal away something that would not stay sealed. In homes throughout the city, as the days turned to weeks, the fear settled into routine. Mothers kept their children close. The route that Thomas Cook had walked every morning began to be avoided. New paperboys were found, but none of them would volunteer for the early hours before dawn. The route was split between 3 older boys who walked it together in daylight, even though it meant the newspapers arrived late. The sealed section of Enfield Avenue fell into deeper silence. Grass grew through the cracks in the street. The boarded warehouses aged. The fence posts where the cloth strips had been tied were eventually removed, and in the mill offices and on the docks, men still did not speak about what had happened. They simply reminded the younger hands, the way old knowledge is passed down in small cities. You don't walk that stretch alone before sunrise. Not ever. Not now. Not after what happened to the paperboy. What happened to the paperboy? As if there were only one thing that had ever happened worth remembering. 90 years have passed. The warehouse on Enfield Avenue was torn down in 1952. The sealed street was unsealed in 1957, when the city decided the buildings could be salvaged after all. The barricade came down on a Tuesday morning, and the street was open to traffic again. New businesses moved in. The city tried to forget. But people in Duluth, Minnesota did not forget. They simply learned to live with the forgetting, the way you live with a scar that pulls tight when the weather changes. Thomas Cook would be 96 years old now if he were alive. His mother died in 1961. Ruth, his sister, lived until 1998. She never married. She never left Duluth. In her last years, young people would sometimes ask her about her brother, about the morning he vanished, about the note and the jacket and the cloth strips that appeared in impossible places. She would answer them, but carefully, as if the act of speaking about it too clearly might reopen something that should remain closed. "I remember his whistles," she said once to a recorder held by a young student doing local history. "Even after he was gone, I could hear them. At 4:45 in the morning I would wake and hear them, and I would know he was still there, still making his route, still keeping time the way he always did." When asked if she believed he was dead, she would not answer directly. She would only say, "I believe what I saw. I believe what the neighborhood told me. I believe what the men found. But I also believe what I heard, and I believe what a mother hears. Those are not always the same thing." In the years after 1934, the behavior of Duluth, Minnesota, changed in ways that were never formally acknowledged, but were understood by every hand who worked on the docks or in the mills. Paperboys were never again assigned to routes that included Enfield Avenue, even after the street was reopened and buildings were restored. When newspapers were delivered there, they were brought in groups in daylight, never before sunrise. The practice continued into the 1960s, long after most of the original search party was dead. At the mill where Thomas Cook's father had worked, and where the young boy's photograph hung on a corkboard in the office for 40 years, new workers were told the story on their first week. The older hands made sure of it, not as a formal lesson, just as a casual remark over coffee. "That's where it happened. That stretch there. Don't walk it alone before dawn. It's stupid, I know, but nobody does it. Even now, nobody does. Even now." The story moved through families the way all local stories move, passed from grandparents to parents to children, refined and sharpened with each telling, losing details that seemed unimportant and keeping the ones that made the skin prickle. The paperboy became a figure of tragedy and impossible strangeness. Children in Duluth, Minnesota, grew up knowing they should not walk down that street before sunrise, knowing they should not answer a whistle that sounded like a paperboy's call, knowing they should watch for cloth strips on fence posts and folded bags that appeared in the wrong place. The question that had moved through the city in 1934, what took him into a place that was supposed to be sealed, became a kind of local koan. Different families developed different answers, different ways of understanding it. Some said a man had taken him, someone from the sealed warehouses, someone who had been hiding there, who had forged the note and stolen the jacket and planted the cloth strips. A predator. A simple human evil. This explanation made sense. It was rational. It fit inside the boundaries of what the world was supposed to contain. Others whispered that he had run away, that the note was real, that he had written it himself, in a moment of desperation, and that he had chosen to walk into that sealed street and disappear, that the warmth of the jacket was just a misremembering, the way memories warm themselves over time, that Thomas Cook, at 16, had decided that somewhere beyond the barricade was better than what waited for him in the small city. This explanation was darker, but still human. It still made sense, but there were those, fewer of them, and they never spoke about it out loud in public, only in the privacy of their own homes, who held a third possibility. They believed what the impossible facts suggested. They believed that something in that sealed street had been waiting. They believed that the cloth strips had been tied by a hand that should not have been there. They believed that the note came from Thomas Cook because Thomas Cook, having crossed some boundary between the world and whatever lay beyond it, was still trying to communicate with the place he had left behind. They believed that the warm jacket meant he was alive, or that something wearing his shape was alive in a way that made the question of whether he was alive or dead irrelevant. But they did not speak this out loud. Not in Duluth, Minnesota, not even now. What they did speak out loud was the warning passed down like a prayer, like a ward against evil, like the simple rules that keep a small city safe in the face of an incomprehensible world. Don't walk Enfield Avenue before dawn. Don't answer the whistle. Don't touch any cloth strips you see tied to the posts. Don't go near the sealed places even after they're unsealed. Don't assume that what you see is what you think you see. Not in that part of town, not in the hours before the sun. Parents tell their children. Teachers tell their students. Grandparents tell their grandchildren. It is told so often, so casually, that it becomes simply part of the geography of Duluth, Minnesota. Like don't go near the breakwater during storms or don't walk on thin ice. It becomes common sense. It becomes local knowledge. It becomes the price of living in a place where something stopped making sense 90 years ago and has never started again. The newspaper bag has never been found since March 15, 1934. The city took it into evidence, and then it disappeared from the evidence room sometime in the 1970s. No one remembers exactly when. No one remembers who checked it out last. The superintendent of police at that time had since died. His records were lost in a fire, so the satchel, dry, folded neat, impossible, vanished a second time as if the world had decided to erase one of the few pieces of proof. The note has survived. It is held in the Duluth Historical Society in a climate-controlled case. Visitors can see it. They can read the handwriting. They can hold the photograph and compare it to samples of Thomas Cook's other writing. School books, postcards, a Christmas card he wrote to his mother the December before he disappeared. The handwriting is identical. Every loop, every cross of a T, every curve. A graphologist examined it in 1987 and declared it genuine. There is no scientific reason to believe it was forged, and yet there is also no scientific reason to believe that a living boy could write a note after he has vanished without a trace in a sealed-off section of a city, with no footprints leading in or out. No way to have reached that place, no explanation that fits inside the boundaries of the world as it is supposed to work. So the note remains in its case. People can see it, but they do not know what to do with what they see. In recent years, the question has become a kind of meditation in Duluth, Minnesota. Students write papers about it. Local historians mention it in talks. A podcast dedicated itself for several episodes to trying to solve the disappearance of Thomas Cook. But nothing has changed. The mystery has not been solved. The answer has not been found. What has happened is that the mystery has been domesticated. It has been made safe by being placed at a distance. 90 years of distance, the distance of historical time, the distance of then versus now. But parents still tell their children not to walk that street before dawn. Paperboy still will not take routes through Enfield Avenue if they can help it. And on quiet mornings in Duluth, Minnesota, when the frost lies thick and the darkness is still absolute, there are still people who wake at 4:30 a.m. and lie still in their beds listening for a sound they have never heard, but somehow know exactly what it would sound like. A two-note whistle. A boy keeping rhythm as he walks through the dark, delivering newspapers to houses where people are still asleep, keeping time, staying on schedule, finishing his route as if nothing had ever changed, as if he had never vanished, as if there were no sealed streets and no impossible facts and no questions that could never be answered. What makes sense here? A man in hiding, or a boy who chose to leave, or a boundary that will not stay sealed no matter how many times you try to nail it shut? Which of those explanations sits easiest in your mind, and which version does nobody in Duluth, Minnesota dare to say out loud even now, even after 90 years? The men who were part of that search party are almost all gone now. Hull is gone. Corvin is gone. Bryce, the constable who found the note, died in 1968, but their children remember. Their grandchildren remember. The story lives. It lives in the geography of the city, in the streets you walk and the ones you avoid, in the hours you feel safe and the ones you do not, in the knowledge that there are places in the world where the rules change, and you cannot know when you have crossed into them until it is too late. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.